Okay, just doing a quick walkthrough here of the Lincoln Center Education Algorithm. It's a holistic, integrative, innovative, pedagogically focused instructional methodology that's rooted firmly in the fine arts. And so that's the basis of its appeal in terms of using it as a unit or lesson structuring algorithm. So in this presentation, I basically explicate the algorithm in 10 steps, noting though that it's the sequence that matters more than the number of steps. I could break it down into more steps or probably compress it into less steps, but that isn't so important. What is important is the actual sequence of steps. So anyway, this algorithm is one of the key architectural elements or pillars of the first year seminar course. We're using it to structure the internal dynamics of each unit of study. So this is pretty much the sort of interior architecture, so to speak, for the units. So I'm just going to walk through these 10 steps in a fairly quick fashion here. So first step is for instructors to gather and identify possible target artworks. These are ones that's seen as having high potential to help students realize curricular or course goals or unit goals, right? So the idea is to pick artworks that you've already done some initial thinking about. You kind of have to think your way into the artwork and figure out what it is really about and what it's made with, so that you can decide whether it's a useful one or not. So right away, the selection of artworks has to be mindful, right? So you're selecting these artworks with an eye to, or a mind to, how you're going to use them to do some teaching. So for example, if the learning is to be about the self in a given course or unit goal, I'm going to kind of play out this as an example throughout this presentation, then artworks such as self-portraits, dramatic monologues, etc. might be among the items I gather for potential use. So again, what I'm doing here in step one is I'm proliferating options, artworks that could work. I'm just making a list of them so that I can then do some thinking about them and select meaningfully from the list. And so the second step then is that selection. So you basically pick from the list something that has high value, meaning high potential for revealing important course content or getting after course or unit goals. And so again, in the example I'm playing out, if self-image is an important concept, then it might make sense for me to select from my list of possible artworks a self-portrait or two to focus on rather than a dramatic monologue, unless the latter is about self-image, because through self-portraiture I can get at that concept of self-image fairly directly. So that's the kind of thinking, but it's really a thought process at the front end. You're gathering things and then you're making a selection process. Third step is that once the artwork is selected, you want to analyze or break it down into component parts, or what I call building block concepts or processes. You're trying to get a list of concepts or processes that the artist likely worked with or built with in putting the work together in the first place. So you're trying to do a particular kind of analysis. Basically, and then you're sort of reverse engineering it. You're starting from the artwork, which you're not revealing to students, by the way. You haven't mentioned what the artwork is or who the artist is. Right now you're just doing the work on your own. So you're doing this kind of analysis, this kind of reverse engineering. You're starting with the artwork, and then you're trying to figure out what are the building blocks that the artist used to make it. So for example, if I were to select a self-portrait or two by Cindy Sherman, I might on analysis note that she seems to work with concepts of like multiplicity, identity, personas, role-playing. Those are sort of like concepts, and then with processes like photography and series photography in particular. So at this point I would have some building blocks to work with. So again, the things I'm teaching to here are the concepts of multiplicity, so I could be becoming familiar with that concept, because that's what I'm teaching. I'm not really teaching about this artwork. I'm teaching about the building blocks that went into making it. So if multiplicity is one of those building blocks, I'm sort of teaching to that. So I've got my subject matter here kind of laid out: multiplicity, identity, personas, etc. These are one level beneath the surface. So at this point I have the building blocks to work with, and these are again the things that I will be teaching to. A big red sign here just to note that so far I've been gathering these artworks, selecting ones with high potential, analyzing them. All of this has been done behind the scenes. This is just done by the instructor. So in the Lincoln Center education algorithm, the work itself, the artwork, like this in this case, if I'm going to reveal Cindy Sherman's self-portraits, I don't do that till somewhere in the middle of this process. Definitely not in the beginning, right? So this is really a flipped model. This is a flipped lesson model. Instead of starting with the object and reading about it and that kind of stuff, you more or less finish with the reveal of the object, and wrap it up from there and contextualize it. So it is really a kind of a flipped or reversed order. So I want to emphasize that. So anyway, that's the first three steps. Step 4 is to begin the actual teaching. So now teaching 2 building block concepts and processes initially involves prompted conversation with students. And so in this example I'm playing out here, again, there may be conversations about things like selfhood, identity, self-image, the role of photography in contemporary life, the phenomenon of selfies, the habit of checking oneself in the mirror. These kinds of things I would use as ground in which to develop some discussion prompts, to ask some questions, to get some seminar style conversation going about questions of personal identity, self-image, things like that, that are relatively immediate for people to understand what the question is about, and to talk about, give their perspective on. So that's one of the first things to do, is to start to articulate the concepts and processes through conversation. In step 5, then the conversations about building block concepts or processes can lead, or can be done in tandem or simultaneously with hands-on exercises involving the same concepts or processes. So in this case, just for example, again, we might develop some hands-on exercises involving the production of selfies with phones, or a prompted assignment for something like to go and make 2 selfies that look like they're 2 different people, etc. So to get into the notions of self-image and how that's malleable and changeable and depends on perspective and context and a lot of things like that. So you can get at some of the content very directly from these kind of hands-on activities. And again, this can be done in conjunction with or following opening conversations about the same concept. So again, notice that we still haven't mentioned Cindy Sherman or whatever artist I might be looking at, or whatever example I might be looking at of that person's artwork. I haven't revealed any of that just yet. So step 6, any artifacts, sort of exercise artifacts or work products, etc., that students generate. So things like, for example, those selfies can then be discussed and critiqued, and so that's valuable data, right? So that can be used to further get into the concepts of self-image and self and all those kind of things that, again, root back to, in this example, root back to the assumption that's a subject matter that the class is trying to get at. So anyway, the exercises and conversations feed each other, and there is a framework for critique that's kind of built into the Lincoln Center education model overall. It's called Capacities for Imaginative Thinking. I post that on the next slide because it's so you can use this to ask some questions. And so basically it looks like this, that you'd be, whether it's looking at some student work examples or an actual artwork example, this is sort of a framework for critique. And so you're encouraging students to do things like initially notice deeply, just use their senses and try to just delve into the work on that level, and then to pose questions. You're encouraging people to make connections, identify patterns, to embody the content, to empathize, to live with whatever ambiguity might be found in artwork. I mean, it's often there. to then create some meaning, create some interpretation in a way, and then possibly take action. How would at least imagine how you might take action or turn this into a work of your own or an action of your own, etc. So that's one framework for critique. But that anyway, that to go back to step 6. So that's basically you're talking about and critiquing any work products that students generate. In step 7, you're finally revealing the artwork. So at this point in the process, I would, if I was going to use Cindy Sherman self-portraits, I would reveal those, and so I might, in this case, I kind of sort of would have to reveal more than one, just to show that the ways that she's playing with multiplicity and personas and identity and those types of things through her work. So you'd reveal that artwork, and then you could go back to that same list of questions you might ask to critique the actual artwork. Ask the same thing, to observe it really closely, and then ask questions and make connections, and all those kind of the same steps can be applied. In step 8, you're just applying those steps to the artwork itself. Step 9, you're then doing, and this is back to the idea of this being a flipped model, you're back now to more or less traditional study. You're taking the artwork and putting it in context, right? So readings, viewings, etc. And the context you can be diving into artist biographies, that context, the personal context, the historical time frame, the historical context, historical antecedents for that kind of work, for self-portraiture. That's a very rich history. Theories of the self, that's another context. And so you would basically choose places to dive deeper into the content, again here in a fairly more traditional way. So if it's theories of the self you're really trying to get at with these conversations and activities, then you would do some readings on that particular one. But lots of different directions you could go in terms of contextualizing the artwork, and that again that's where the traditional study part comes in. And then the last step, you would then be able to discuss those readings and make connections between them and the assignments, the exercises and the prior conversations. And so have some wrap-up conversations that include the readings and the viewings, etc. And have those conversations go towards the production of reflective or concluding knowledge products by students, which, again, to play out the same example, in this case might call for the production of an image project accompanied by a reflective narrative of process describing what was learned in the process of completing the image project and what was learned from the various parts of the unit in an overall or summary sense. So this would sort of bring closure to it, and then you would be essentially ready to move on to the next unit.